That point will be reached when the army is required to enforce control on the population that is now becoming so hungry that they're now venturing outdoors to try and find food. And now the army has to make a decision. What does it do with an unruly population that's out searching for food? So if the army can't supply sufficient rationing, there's not enough food to go around, then the army has to maintain control. And so what are they going to do? They're going to maybe arrest people that are out breaking curfews. And they can say, oh, we're doing it for the good of the people, for the good of everyone. We are arresting these people. But actually, they might just be hungry. And so they're going to have to take these people and lock them up. So that's the interesting point, where people start worrying about their own survival, their own family survival, and they need to start breaking the rules that the government has imposed. Then the question is, what does the army do? How does it respond? Is it a violent response? Is it a civilized response? That's the turning point. And then when word gets out about how the army treats its own population, then things might spiral out of control.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum, and the media overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time: cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the grand solar minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne, creator of the Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age 2015 to 2035 video series.
Good afternoon, everyone. David DuByne here, Mini Ice Age Conversations in the Adapt 2030 channel on YouTube. So many important events happening in the economic world. I understand things are tied to a lot of the lockdown, and we've seen the economy implode across the planet, but it's a much wider scope happening at the moment than a cruise line not being able to take guests on board, that industry of cruise leisure travel or airline travel, or the industry of restaurants and hospitality and hotels, and those who've set their life up around Airbnb rentals in debt up to their eyeballs, and then suddenly that industry crashes, and it shall not return in our lifetimes, in my personal opinion. But there's so much more going on. I have a guest with me tonight, wants to remain pretty much anonymous due to his position in finance, done some fintech before, cryptocurrency, and also knows how to brew up and create his own honey mead. So, the skill sets that we all have, whether it be somebody who knows how to garden at a master level, or somebody who's a brewer, or somebody who knows how to distill, or, have medicine or EMT skills, you just never know what kind of, skill set somebody can bring to the table as we march through these changes, which we're going to be more self-sufficient, as we move through a lot of these things. But with that said, you know me through my Grand Solar Minimum channel for the last 5 years plus now. I was saying that about a year out from the food shortages, not to the point where people are going to, really starve on the planet, but to the point where there's going to be such massive price rises and unavailability of the bottom earners of society, whatever country it could be, choose your XYZ country, whichever you like, it's going to cause civil unrest. And at that point, society is going to start to implode on its own weight, because people on the periphery will join those that are struggling to, it wouldn't even be make ends meet. It would just be simply you don't have enough money to buy the food. And if the government didn't raise gargantuan sums of money to be able to feed into the social assistance programs, it would just fall apart at the seams. I've been saying this since week 1 of my channel. About a year out, they're going to do a couple of things, because if we look at the last 5 grand solar minimums, and that'll take us back approximately 2,000, or I'll even squeak it back to the Homeric minimum 2,400 years ago. The same things happen every grand solar minimum. This cycle in our sun on a 400-year period, we get massive crop losses and massive food inflation to the point where most people can't afford the food. The battles ensue with the troops trying to transport food, the inavailability of food. People move to different locations. There's massive population migration, and the society kind of resets itself. You're talking 2,400 years ago, 79 AD, late antique little ice age, 535 would come up to the spore or wolf minimum, 1350, the Maunder minimum, 1680 or 1640 to 1710, however you like that middle point there. Got the Dalton minimum, circa 1810. And then we're back right now to the exact same circumstance society faced of this grand solar minimum. And here we are with a lockdown of the planet. I understand there's a virus out there and it's decimating a lot of people, countries. But the response so far comparatively to the amount of deaths that would be from heart disease, for example, or automobile accidents eclipses this like exponentially. The amount of people breathing bad air through the polluted skies due to our never-ending greed on this planet and consuming all the resources to pump out pollution and half the world's unchecked, unmitigated, never-ending stream of particles coming out of smokestacks that really hinder people's health. That is literally 200 times more. No, sorry, I got it wrong. 2,000 times more than has currently happened right now. So when in the scope of things, why is the lockdown happening? And is it much more about food and now the economy being reset? And this is why I wanted to talk to Hal, because, you know, with his level of expertise, I have the one end of it with the food, with the crop losses, with the repeating cycles, but the economy is a central point that links it all together. And if you've been reading through Zero Hedge over the last few weeks, if you've been following the up and down swings, the greatest gain ever in the markets since the markets began, and the greatest loss since the markets began, in the following day, in 2 days, you get the up and downs like this. Something's not normal. The banks have run out of money. The credit system is locking back up again. And just a quick FYI before Hal comes on, the supply chains are not going to be refilled. The amount of food that's not in there now because of the just-in-time ordering system, factories have been closed across our planet for almost 2 months, and it looks like the closures are going to continue for several more months. So if you think your shelves are going to suddenly refill themselves after maybe there's this partial unlockdown, it's going to be a year, maybe two, before everything comes back to normal, if there ever is another normal again, which I highly doubt. 2001, 9/11, there was never another normal after that. Once things are in play, they never go back to the way they were. We're entering another new world, but faster. After 9/11, it took us 20 years to get to this point. It took us 2 weeks to get to this point, and you see how much more control there is right now. Now, it all revolves around the economy. And Hal, I'm sorry I'm babbling so much. Welcome, Hal. You can feel free to give an introduction. It depends on how anonymous you would like to stay. You know, your area of expertise, because I know you know a few people out there. But thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on your show, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you. You're one of the few people addressing the issue. It's a crisis, and somebody needs to be asking the difficult questions. And so I think it's really important that you've started the conversation, and I think we need to get more and more people joining in so that we can review what's been happening. As you said yourself, a decade's worth of news has happened in the past couple of weeks. And we need to kind of sit back and review what's happened, analyze these recent events to see what's gone wrong in order to try and figure out what's the solution, what's the way forward, how do we get out of this mess, because we're in a mess. You touched on it earlier in your introduction. You mentioned the economic shock, the supply shock, which then became a demand shock. So that economic shock exposed an underlying problem, which is a far more chronic problem and far more serious, in my opinion. And I think our financial system is not fit for purpose. It's systemically flawed. It cannot succeed because of the very mechanics of how it was built and how it works. And so I think we need to ask very fundamental questions like, what kind of monetary system do we want? Do we even have a monetary system? Because I think that's the crux of the issue is that we don't have a proper monetary system. And that's now been exposed because of the recent economic standstill. First, we had China being locked down. Wuhan was locked up. That was on the 23rd of January. And so the supply shut down, and China was turning back ships of oil. They couldn't take the oil. That then turned into a lockdown around the rest of the world, which led to a demand shock. So initially it was a supply shock and then a demand shock, and that's all the economic system.
And how prepared are you for the transition into the grand solar minimum? Are you prepared for emergencies? Our friends at My Patriot Supply do have emergency survival food, the 2-week grab-and-go food crate or the 4-week food supply. They also have water filtration and items that you can use yourself to get ready to pack, such as Mylar bags, oxygen packs, things you can use for your own long-term food storage, and a host of different survival items that you might not have thought about in your preparations. Use the Adapt 2030 link in the description box below. And while you're there, take a look at the selection of heirloom seeds, because you are going to have to grow some of your own food moving forward into the Eddy Grand Solar Minimum. Take back your peace of mind by knowing that you're prepared when others might not be.
And so the tide has been sucked out, the music stopped playing, there are not enough chairs, and now people are looking around. And what I think we can see is that our financial system has ground to a halt. There's a massive credit crunch. We've had a credit crunch before. We had that during the global financial crisis, 2007, 2008. And here we are again. They kicked the can down the road and never fixed the underlying problems. And what was a credit crunch back in 2007 is now a giant credit crunch now, because in the intervening 13 years or so, all that's happened is that even more debt has been issued, even more credit has entered the system, and there is not enough dollar liquidity to serve people's needs. When I say people, I mean globally. So here we are, and we need to figure out what can we do from here.
Yeah, and the reason we're even starting this conversation is because following Zero Hedge, I'd read a fair few articles, and Hal had also, and we came to the same conclusion. You know, United States turned into a communist nation in just a week or so. I mean, if you look at the definition of what communism is, where the government owns all private industry and then orders it to work for government, not just the Production Act that Trump had signed. That's so small, that's dust lost down the vent there. But when you have the Fed coming in to buy private securities, now the government is a major owner in almost every corporation that it bailed out. It bought all the treasuries back that it's issued, and then it bought all the distressed bond issuance back and controls that. And then who was at BlackRock that was going to manage all these purchases of the different equities coming in under government control? Let's put it in too basic of a form there. I mean, government now owns almost all private equity, bonds, and treasuries in the United States and the entire stock market. Am I correct with that, or partial?
Yes, I think that's the way it's heading. And I think you're right to highlight it. It looks like they are trying to nationalize the ownership of the means of production, is communistic terminology. And what it means is essentially the government takes over control of companies, of the economy, of commodities, of the entire economy. And the government sets the prices of securities. And so you have price controls, price setting. That all sounds like communism. See how it got to this stage is because prior to them nationalizing ownership of all the companies, the shares, the corporate bonds, the sovereign bonds, there was a liquidity crunch. There was not enough dollars circulating in the euro dollar system, the offshore dollar system that the national financial institutions use. And so they were trying to address the liquidity shortfall, and they said, well, people don't have enough dollars in the system, so we're going to just print more money and make it readily available to everyone. So we're going to drop the cost of the dollars that we're printing to almost zero, and to zero in some cases, so that anyone who has any form of collateral. Now, collateral could range from good quality collateral, which is sovereign bond, to corporate bonds, to municipal bonds, and now they've extended it through their primary dealer credit facility so that primary dealers can offer up securities, particularly equities, as a form of collateral. And the government's going to buy those, so the primary dealers will park these overnight with the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is going to give the primary dealers cash in return. So essentially, you've got the Federal Reserve and central banks around the world taking ownership of equities, which is bizarre. That is nationalizing the ownership of the means of production. And that looks like communism.
So let me jump in there. That sounds exactly like China just last year, where, well, it had been an ongoing problem. The reason there were so many bond defaults in China last year specifically, when it really started to hit the airwaves, and there was a lot of talk of, oh, this is the fifth largest company, oh, this is the sixth largest company, it's the third largest company, oh, why can't they pay back? Well, what's happening? Why are they defaulting across the entire spectrum there in China? Well, the same thing happened. They were pledging securities of their own companies as the collateral. But at that time, their prices also were at all-time highs. So when the shares fell, sometimes 80, 90%, when those bonds came due, they were looking at something like a 90% reduction in the actual value. There's no way they could pay anything back. And the communist government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to bail some out and let some go. But then the point was how many people lost their funds over there. And then it started to become a social issue. And a lot of protests arose out of that. And then suddenly we had everything here, which stopped everything on a dime. If you look, the Hong Kong protest stopped, the Wuhan protest stopped. You got to realize Wuhan last year in July and August, if you're thinking Hong Kong, that's the number one biggest. Wuhan was the second biggest because they had trash burning incinerators that were going to generate electricity, and the citizens organized and said, no, you're not. And they made the army back down. But this is a place where the real estate values had fallen, and also there was an enormous amount of debt default there because that's one of the largest auto manufacturing areas in China, as well as a whole bunch of periphery industries that are into that, from glass making to everything carbon black tires and everything all the way through. And all those same, let's say, creative bookkeeping used through that industry across the landscape of China all ran into the same problem at the same time. And it's real interesting that the fallout is happening now where nobody's talking about it. Nobody can organize about it. You can't get together. Everybody's got to be separated now.
And this episode's brought to you by TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds since 1974. Full range of garden seeds, microgreen seeds, sprouting seeds, wheatgrass, grain seeds, flower seeds, herb seeds, and ground cover crop. I encourage you to take a look at their website, TrueLeafMarket.com, and they even have free starter guides there for you to learn how to grow sprouts, microgreens, herbs, and wheatgrass. Use the link below and give yourself the gift of organic and heirloom seeds.
Yep, China is a really interesting case because...
Sorry, Hal, the reason I brought it up is because it's very similar to what you just said about the nationalization and pledging equities in terms of trying to get something off the repo market or, cash coming back out. It's the exact same thing. Now, look how much equities have fallen. So I'll leave it there.
Well, no, that's the problem. When the government takes ownership of the means of production, then there's no more price discovery. There's no more free market. It's not capitalism anymore. What capitalism needs to be healthy is it needs proper price discovery. And what we don't have is price discovery, because whenever there's a sell-off, then along comes the biggest player on the block, which is the central reserve, the central banks. They come in with unlimited firepower, and they can buy up whatever securities are being sold. And so they can pump up the price to whatever price they want. And that's what I meant by price controls. They can set the price to whatever they want, because we're not dealing with ordinary investors who have an eye on the risk. There's greed and fear playing off. But when you've got a central bank and they have a mandate to maintain stability, that's their key thing. And that's what you hear out of China as well, the Chinese political system. Their main goal is to maintain stability. And now you hear the Federal Reserve saying the same thing. They're trying to maintain stability, which means they don't want any sudden sell-off in the market. They don't want a crash in asset prices. So they're coming in with unlimited firepower, and they're buying up whatever's being sold, and so the prices stabilize. And the problem there is it's not capitalism anymore, because capitalism needs certain companies to fail, the ones that are not fit for purpose. You need the competition, you need the washout of the inefficient companies, and only the strong survive. That's what makes capitalism good, is that it keeps the whole system lean and mean, and the fittest survive. But when you get the government coming in and using its money printer to buy up everything, then what that leads to is complacency and inefficiency. If you're a corporate executive, you don't have to try so hard anymore. You don't have to work so hard, because you know the government's going to backstop you.
And the terms that you're talking about, the stabilization in China, would be the harmonious society.
Right.
And you hear these catchwords again and again. And, I just saw that American government is now mandating, not asking, but requiring by law that GE produce ventilators for the U.S. What's that? The Defense Production Act, and now GM is legally required to produce ventilators. I understand people aren't going to be buying appliances, et cetera, but, when the government could come in and say, all right, you need to retool your factory, no ifs, ands, or buts, where does that leave us?
Right. So then GE can turn around and say, well, you're interfering with our process, our normal business, so you need to give us some form of kickback to compensate for our lost productivity. And so you then get a whole change in focus. They no longer need to worry about failing because they know the government's going to support them. So they no longer need to stay competitive.
Fair price, Hal, fair price. And then who determines what the fair price is?
The government sets the price.
See?
And that's where it gets all out of whack, because the free market should set the price. It should be supply and demand. That's how it should be working. We've long since left that. And so we're in this strange area where the government's trying to decide what's a fair price, what's normal, what's stable. And they don't know. They're not experts at running companies. They don't know how to run an economy. That's not their job.
Yeah, and a quick history lesson. Every single time that one of these grand solar minimums come around, it's always about the food, because I don't care how much money you have. This whole fictitious game of smoke and mirrors with zeros on a screen, you can't print the food. So when we're coming into this year, now let me give you the setup here for this year's planting. China is the major fertilizer producer on the planet, hands down. They're having a fertilizer shortage in their own country. And they're running with a pesticide shortage as well. But the locusts are over there running amok. Now, we here in the United States should have imported something like 800 million tons so far in Q1 because the planting season's on top of us. So generally, one of the largest amount of imports of fertilizer comes in through these last 4 months to get us ready for planting in the fields. We have almost nothing. So American agriculture is going to struggle. So let's say we have the seed and it finally dries out because we're into the second wettest year again after last year, delayed planting, extreme wet conditions. Well, what about our pesticides and herbicides? We just don't have it in the fertilizers. It's not in the supply chain to even get it to us. So talking about low agricultural yields this year, I really believe this is the rollover year that's going to break the back on the global economy. But the history lesson about this is every time this comes through, when people start starving and fighting for food and overthrowing governments, the currencies collapse. There's nothing that survived during these times of these grand solar minimums, and it always is a reset or some type of currency devaluation, the change in the currency, especially the change in, let's say, rulership style. And the reason I would even say that is because it seems over the last 3 weeks, there's been a new mandate from somewhere to maintain a different farming system on the planet of the way the human behaves. There's a different management technique for humanity that's just been installed. That would make sense if we're coming into massive food shortages and crop losses over the next year. That's going to freak people out 10 times worse than it is now.
Government's really concerned about food shortages because, depending on who you talk to, but there's a saying that anarchy is only 9 missed meals away. That's the important point, is that when people go hungry, then they start getting militant and they get active. And that's a problem for government because then they can't maintain stability. When people are hungry, there's no more compliance and obedience anymore. They've got to get food, otherwise they starve. And so they've got to find food for their family. And then they don't care what the government says, can't control people anymore. And governments, they've seen so many cases in history where people went hungry and then anarchy followed. And so they need to implement controls on the whole supply chain. And they need to manage the distribution of food. They need to manage the growing of food and all the supply chains in between. Because if they don't, then people are going to go hungry. And if people go hungry, then those governments get toppled.
But there needs to be a legitimate excuse, and coming out right, telling people about the grand solar minimum that you're working along like just up until a couple of weeks ago. Imagine if they wouldn't have said it was the virus, it was the grand solar minimum, and we need to take control of your food supply. That would have been a no-go. Yeah, there had to be a different excuse. They couldn't come clean for the real reason.
Because up until now, they've been blaming carbon dioxide for the change in the global weather system. And now, if they come out and change that story and say, no, actually it's the sun, then people are going to say, well, hang on. You used to talk about man-made carbon dioxide levels being too high, upsetting the weather, affecting the food. But now you're saying it's not that at all. So then they lose credibility. And if they lose credibility, then people don't trust them anymore. That's a big problem. So they needed a cover story to implement their greater levels of control. And the cover story just so happens to have been a virus. Initially started spreading through China and now is global. To implement some of the other changes they know they need to, and then they don't need to create another excuse. They already have the narrative for why they need to do this, and it's plausible. They can drum up fear in the media, they can drum up panic, and they can force people to stay indoors, and that's how they control the population. It's a well-known technique. You kick up a fear, you introduce a new enemy. People then say to the government, please, government, help us, save us. And then the people will invest more powers and more control and more authority in the government. And now the government's got its cover story, go about and implement some of the other changes that you needed to implement.
Well, you look at the soft drip rationing already. I mean, in a war, you have ration cards. In a war, you need to do without so the soldiers have the food, the soldiers have the resources. You don't drive because the fuel needs to be sent off somewhere else. So look at what's happening in the stores. Limit 1, limit 2. I saw limits for Ziploc bags in the Costco, and I was shocked. And then getting into the Costco as well. You had to go through, it was very much like going through airport security screening. I was shocked. The only thing that wasn't there was the X-ray machine that I would have had to step through to get pat down to see if I was bringing any firearms in. Otherwise, they ran it in the exact same way. It's almost like somebody trained them in line up here, go left. Lane 7, oh, stop, you're over the line. Oh, there, oh, you have to go this way. You can only go one way. You have to, yes, sir, move through this way, move through. It's almost as if the rationing is here. They're getting you ready, closing the stores early, only allowing a certain amount of people in to try to extend out the amount of food, because if there's not that many buyers in there and they're drip feeding and then putting limits on everything, they can squeak the supply chain out for maybe an extra 2 to 3 weeks because the massive buying's not there. It's a controlled knob of buying now, so they've wired it out into how much buying there could be per day. But same kind of terminology you're going to be experiencing in the soft drip feed into the rationing. They're going to be food rationing because of this grand solar minimum. Dismal crop yields this year that are really going to make not a ripple but a tidal wave through the markets of food here. We're at it again. So the level of control is going to need to continue to increase. And just like they did in Wuhan in the beginning, it was citizens and employees stationed everywhere to tell people what to do. But after a transition period of about 2 to 3 weeks, it was 100% military where there used to be civilians.
That's right. And they've implemented enforced lockdowns everywhere. And then people are, in many countries, allowed to go and buy their essential supplies in the shops. And then they get to the shops and then they see the shelves are emptying quickly, in some cases completely empty. But there's still sufficient supply at the moment to kind of top up those shelves for the next coming days. But as those supplies dry up, then the government has the perfect excuse to call in the army to maintain the supply lines from production all the way through to distribution. And once they've got the army in place, then they can control the supply. Then the next step is how do they further extend the control? You talked about maybe some form of financial assistance that comes from the government to the people, because the people at the moment are short of income because they're locked up. They can't work their normal jobs. So their incomes are down. So the government's going to step up and say, you know what, everybody's struggling through this. We're going to assist monthly allowances for food, maybe monthly allowances for diesel, for petrol, for your electricity, for your water, for your rental. And we're going to provide this on a monthly basis. And so long as you're a good, obedient, compliant citizen, we will keep topping up your debit card. Talk about what form it might take, but it's going to be government-issued rations and sufficient money to supply every month so that people can survive. But the important point is that they need to get the army in place, and they've got the excuse to do that. So only the army can go out in a time of national emergency.
That's all great for the Army to be protecting the food supply distribution points, but when there's no food being grown in the fields to even protect to bring to the markets, this is the whole underlying ACE card that I keep looking at, is the amount of food being grown this year without the fertilizers, still in the atrocious conditions, the field's not even refurbished from last year, 5 million acres that they're trying to harvest right now that was stranded in the fields from last winter with the early blizzards, the extreme rains again in the southern and southeast U.S., and somehow we're supposed to magically walk out of this. Who cares if the Army's there to take control? There won't be anything for them to control. At what point is the smoke and mirrors and the curtains lift behind and we really see there's nothing? At that point, that's the point I'm getting at that checkmate point. Then what?
That point will be reached when the Army is required to enforce control on the population that is now becoming so hungry that they're now venturing outdoors to try and find food. And now the Army has to make a decision. What does it do with an unruly population that's out searching for food? So if the Army can't supply sufficient rationing, there's not enough food to go around, then the Army has to maintain control. And so what are they going to do? They're going to maybe arrest people that are out breaking curfews. And they can say, oh, we're doing it for the good of the people, for the good of everyone. We are arresting these people. But actually, they might just be hungry. And so they're going to have to take these people and lock them up. So that's the interesting point, where people start worrying about their own survival, their own family's survival, and they need to start breaking the rules that the government has imposed. Then the question is, what does the Army do? How does it respond? Is it a violent response? Is it a civilized response? That's the turning point. And then when word gets out about how the Army treats its own population, then things might spiral out of control.
This video is brought to you by our friends at TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds for any grow zone on our planet.